I've been wanting to make this video for a while now, for two reasons. First off, it's a topic that I'm really interested in. I'm really interested in what causes games to fail, to not become the success that they expected to become. And secondly, because it's an important conversation, I think, for fans of a particular game that is in early access or is unfinished to have in order to be objective about the game that they're playing. This is a hard thing to do when you really love a game. It's really hard to be objective about what could cause the game that I play to fail. It's even harder to talk about this when we consider the fact that most games do actually fail by their own metrics. Most games in early access don't either reach 1.0 or reach it in the state they planned on. Most games in Kickstarter remain unfinished, and even most AAA games don't reach the heights that they had intended on. And so when we consider our own game, it's kind of scary to think it also could fail like most of those other games did. And this is just a reality that us who are either Last Epoch players and therefore fans of the game, or those who want to be a fan of the game and are waiting for a 1.0 release have to come to grips with. We're not at that release yet. There are still a lot of features that need to be added, and if some of those features fail, the game could fail along with it. Now, fortunately, the game already has a lot going for it. It's already past some success states, depending on how you look at it. For one, it's got a really good review rating on Steam. It's already got a whole lot of content. The sales numbers for the game are tremendous, even so far as allowing the developers to significantly increase the development size of the team. But all of this has only gotten us this far, where we're still in early access. We're still waiting for multiplayer and, of course, for 1.0. It's still not a game that's competitive with the biggest games in the genre as far as player base goes. There's still a long way to go, depending on what you think success is for Last Epoch. So that brings us to our next point. What is success for Last Epoch? Well, depending on the metrics you use, you could have determined that it already is a very successful game. And you'd be absolutely right. In a lot of ways, it is already very successful, especially for an early access game. But it is early access, and there is a long way to go. There are metrics that still need to be reached, and if they are not reached, it's going to have a significant effect on the long-term viability of the game. So with that in mind, here are three areas where Last Epoch could in fact fail going forward. The first thing that could go wrong is they could have an unsuccessful launch. ARPG fans are no strangers to unsuccessful launches in highly hyped ARPGs. Just look at Wilson. I'm sorry I had to add Wilson. Wilson's going to be used a lot, so unfortunately you're going to have to just deal with it because they are probably the best example of doing everything wrong. But they're certainly not the only ones, and there's no guarantee that Last Epoch couldn't suffer the same fate. The next concern for Last Epoch is whether it can maintain long-term growth and success. Now, so far, the game has done a very good job growing in early access, but again, it is still early access, and expectations change when you have that 1.0 tag on your game. So we'll discuss some ways where this could be potentially affected if the devs make poor decisions or don't execute in certain ways that are necessary to maintain growth after launch. The last one's a bit ambitious, but I believe it's something that Last Epoch could actually accomplish, and so I want to add it here because for me it would be a bit of a disappointment if it at least didn't come close. And that is competing with the big two. The big two being, of course, Path of Exile and Diablo. More specifically, Diablo 4. Diablo 3, of course, is in the big two, but the reality is Last Epoch will be competing with Diablo 4 for most of its life, along with Path of Exile 2, and so those are the targets that it will have if it wants to potentially be in a big 3 instead of just a big 2. So those are the metrics we'll be using in order to determine whether or not the game is successful or whether or not it can fail in some way. But what ways can it actually fail? I've got 8 things that I think, if they don't nail them, will have a significant effect on at least one of those 3 metrics, in often case more than 3. If they don't nail these, there's going to be a problem in the future. So let's go ahead and get into what those 8 things are and also what they will affect. Let's start by discussing the elephant in the room, which is, of course, multiplayer. If multiplayer is bad, well, that's really bad for the game. If it's laggy, if it DCs, has long queues, these are all really, really bad things that are going to have a huge effect on the game, really in all three of the metrics that were mentioned. It's also really worth pointing out that even if you're not a multiplayer player, you will still be significantly affected if multiplayer is poor, because it's going to bring most of the content into a server authoritative environment. Meaning if you want to play in the seasons or do any of the online content, trading, anything like that, which most players will be doing, if there's a laggy server, you're going to feel it, just like the multiplayer folks who are playing with their friends. So you don't get out of it just because you like single player. There's also other ramifications for multiplayer outside of lagginess or DCs. For example, duping. If there's duping in the game because the multiplayer environment allows for exploits, that could absolutely kill the economy. For a good example of how duping can affect an economy in a video game and therefore hold it back, take a look at New World. Also, if you want an example of duping and everything else we've talked about in the multiplayer section, take a look at Wilson. Yes, Wilson again. It did a great job of really missing the mark on pretty much everything we've talked about here. One other side note I'd like to discuss is leaderboards, because right now leaderboards are broken, and that would be really bad if we got to multiplayer and seasons and the leaderboards were easily cheated. Fortunately, we have no reason to think that's going to be the case, because you would expect a server authoritative environment to alleviate all of the problems that the current leaderboard has. So I think we can be pretty comfortable thinking that that's going to be resolved. But I do want to mention, if for some reason it wasn't and leaderboard exploitation was still a thing, that would have a significant downside or negative effect on the game. Number 2, optimization. Now, unlike number 1, this is an issue that currently plagues the game. We don't have multiplayer, so it's not a problem. If it's bad, we wouldn't even know. But we already know that optimization is an issue in the game that needs to be addressed. There are too many times where frames are not only lost, but you basically become a slideshow, particularly in cases where you have a lot of density. These are issues that have been ongoing for a long time, really since I started playing, and while the devs continue to say that they put out more optimization every patch, the biggest issues remain unsolved. If these issues continue, especially into multiplayer environments, it's going to only exacerbate what could be issues in multiplayer. In fact, it wouldn't even matter if multiplayer was good, because the optimization issues would cause multiple players playing on the same map to only make any optimization problems we have worse. If you have 4 players who are all using skills, let's say they're all necromancers and they all have minions, well, the game struggles enough with 1 necromancer with minions. Imagine if you multiply that by a factor of 4. It's going to be a serious issue. And if players cannot play the game in a state that is not a slideshow, a lot of players are going to understandably leave, and the game is going to have a poor reputation for performance. So this is an issue that I believe the devs really need to focus on. And unlike multiplayer, I do have some concerns that it's not enough of a priority, given that the statements we generally get from them are, it's something we work on every patch, yet all of the biggest issues remain unresolved. Next up, let's talk about balance. I really want to focus particularly on balance of builds, but balance in general for this game is something that needs to be addressed going forward. Now, this isn't really surprising, and you can't really fault the devs that balance hasn't been a priority. We're not in a multiplayer environment yet, and multiplayer is going to change balance in drastic ways. Things that weren't synergizing together before are now going to be able to. For example, you'll be able to play a paladin with an acolyte, with a necromancer, and there might be some stuff between those two interactions that are completely broken that need to be adjusted. So it does make sense to not focus much on balance before multiplayer, since you're going to have to do a big balance patch once you get to that point anyway. But because that's the case, it's really hard to judge just how good 11th Hour Games is currently at balancing. They might be very good and just not really focusing on it at all, or they might still be a little bit new to it and struggling a bit to get balance right. We have a lot of examples of where balance hasn't gone very well. There was a new unique that was added that made Werebear Earthquake builds extremely overpowered. It took, I think, 2 patches in order to get that resolved, and then after the new Druid rework, it has effectively been added back to the game because the reworks have caused the mechanic to exist once again after it was effectively wiped out before. That particular build makes the rest of Werebear builds feel pretty much meaningless because it's so much more powerful than anything else in the Werebear's toolkit. And remember, the toolkit is brand new. Werebear just got reworked. It's got some really cool skills, some really cool interactions. It can do a lot of things it couldn't do before, but none of that stuff can overcome the power of the EQ Werebear build that's created by this one unique that, again, has been in the game for a long time, and they haven't found a way to balance around. So what does it look like if EHG never really gets balancing right? Well, unfortunately, it's going to take away one of the most valuable aspects of the game. Last Epoch is great at allowing players to experiment with a lot of different builds and do so in a lot of different ways. If balance is so bad that only 1 or 2 builds at most for every type of build is not just viable, but is broken OP, and everything else is so much weaker in comparison, a lot of that experimentation, that sort of theory crafting that players love to do, is going to be pretty much pointless. There's just no reason to theory craft a Werebear build when EQ Werebear exists. Believe me, I know. I spent a week or 2 doing it this patch, only to come away very frustrated knowing that I'll never ever reach the heights of EQ Werebear, and I'm wasting my time investing in something that requires a lot more investment to get a lot less out of. There's certainly a lot more that could be said about balance, but this isn't a video about balance. It's a video about how Last Epoch could possibly fail. So let's just say that if balancing were not done well enough, it could affect all 3 of the metrics. And then we'll move on to the next section, which is on trade. So trade is a part of the future plans of the game that is very controversial in the community currently. And the reason for that is because about 6 months ago, give or take, the devs released an FAQ on multiplayer, which included their plans for trade. And the trading system was considered by many, myself included, to be overly clunky and restrictive in a way that would probably cause most players to not even bother with trade at all because it's just not worth their time. Now, if this were to occur on live, it could clearly have some impact on the type of players that want to play the game. Now, some players don't like trade and would like to avoid it altogether, and a very restrictive trade system might fit them well. But many other players want a trade system that is, at the very least, viable as a strategy for improving their gear and something that they can do as a significant part of the game. This is something that Path of Exile offers in spades. It's a very wide open system. Now, Last Epoch doesn't want to be that wide open, and I get it. In fact, I agree with it. I don't like it being that wide open myself. But if you are too restrictive, you're too clunky, and you're just doing things that are causing players to not even want to bother with your trade, any players who find a significant amount of enjoyment out of that system will be left out to dry. There's nothing for them to do in that regard. And a lot of players will just not want to be in a game that does that. A lot of people don't play Diablo 3 because it has no real trade system, and they want that in it. So this would be one way that you could definitely limit the level of competition that you can provide against the other games in the genre. Now, Diablo 3, as we mentioned, doesn't really have much trade, but Diablo 3 isn't what they're competing with. They're going to be competing with Diablo 4, which will almost certainly have some sort of trading system. Path of Exile, as we mentioned, has already got completely open trade. If you're the most restrictive in the market for trading, then there's a portion of the player base that's just not going to want to play your game. Now, for some players, they don't want trade. They don't like it. It doesn't add anything to the game for them. And if they're forced to trade, it only makes the game worse. Now, this is certainly the case in Path of Exile for certain players, myself included. If I have to trade in that game, The game is not as enjoyable for me. I try to play in solo self-found, and it's just its own kind of problems because you can't get the items you need. If Last Epoch transitioned to a game where you had to trade to get really good builds, then we would be talking about the other side. Fortunately, that is not the state of the game currently, and no reason to think it's going to change. The game is balanced around solo self-found, so if there is a robust trade economy offered to players, there is also a section of the game offered to players who don't want to trade but still want to have their builds be viable. In this regard, I think the game could actually pull off the best of both worlds. And we're only talking about the trade side because that's the one that it seems like it might miss the mark on. It looks like solo self-found's going to be in a good place, and it's only a matter of whether or not they can nail trade for the players who like it. So the next one is interesting because it's not really potentially triggering any fail states so much as it is a failure to recognize an opportunity for increased or faster success. Then this one is the possibility of taking too long to get to 1.0. So 1.0 for most games is a really important benchmark, mostly psychologically, in my opinion. A lot of players don't play a game until 1.0, and when 1.0 comes out, they go and check it out. This is especially true in ARPGs. We've seen it in other games. Wilson is, once again, the best example we have. A game that had not much of a player base and then launched to over 100,000 players watching on Twitch and playing concurrently. I can't remember the exact number, but it was very high. It was in the 6 figures. That is an opportunity to showcase your game to the world effectively. That is when everyone is watching your game, theoretically. Now, depending on the environment around, what opportunities you actually have to showcase your game might change. For example, launching 1.0 pre-Diablo 4 versus Diablo 4 already existing, and maybe even in an early part of its season. So we already know that Diablo 4 is not launching this year, and I believe we know that PoE 2 is not as well. PoE 2, in my opinion, is a lesser concern because PoE already exists, and PoE 2 is an additional campaign and some changes to the game. It's not the same as Diablo 4 launching. It's still important. If you can get out before PoE 2, that's a good thing, because PoE 2 might bring in more players, and almost certainly will for Path of Exile. But Diablo 4 is really the game that could potentially catapult Blizzard back into the spotlight in ARPGs. If you miss the opportunity to get out in front of that game, and it does well, you are limiting the speed at which you can grow the player base, because a lot of players that like the game, Diablo 4, are just going to play that, and they're not going to go and check out Last Epoch. However, if you're in an ARPG content drought, like we are currently in one, and you launch your game, you're going to get the eyes of the world on you. This is what happened to Wilson. Wilson launched during this very long drought at this point. There hasn't been any new games that are really good that can push the top games for a very long time. Wilson launched and hit huge numbers because of the thought, the dream that it could be in that space with those games. Unfortunately, it didn't happen. It wasn't very good. But if it was, it already had people watching it, and they would have kept playing it. They had people watching it, had people playing it, they would have kept going. So if Last Epoch, if EHG can just launch before those games, it stays in that content drought. And if it's good, it will keep a significant amount of the player base that checks it out at that time. If it launched after Diablo 4 and after PoE 2, there may not be a whole lot of players that are interested in checking out a third game when they already have either or both of those games to play. Now, of course, it's always possible that Diablo 4 launches poorly. It doesn't do well, it's not a very good game, and all of this doesn't really matter. If you launch after Diablo 4, it won't really hurt, because Diablo 4 isn't really holding players back, because it's not the kind of game they necessarily want to play. But are you really willing to risk that? Why would you risk that? You don't have to. If you can get out before Diablo 4, and you can guarantee that you have the eyes of the world on you, why would you choose the alternative? Now, of course, there are a couple of reasons why. Multiplayer's not done, that needs to be finished, of course. All the reasons we've talked about why this game can fail, you need to make sure that those are not problems. You need to make sure you can balance the game properly. You need to make sure it's well optimized, that the trading system is good enough. But there's a lot of stuff on the roadmap that doesn't seem like it needs to be completed before 1.0. A lot of good stuff, of course, endgame systems, mastery classes, and some of that stuff should be able to be finished by the time you get to a 1.0, even if you launch this year. You have to get all of it. If you get multiplayer, if you get optimization, if you get trading right, if you get balancing, what else has to be done? Because the game's already in a pretty good state. It's already a good game. We talked about it already has 88% reviews on Steam. Anything you add is certainly great. But is it worth more than making sure your launch is even better and attracts more players earlier? To further muddy the issue of whether or not EHG should focus on making sure they get a launch before Diablo 4, the last three things on my list are areas where the game, in my opinion, needs to be improved or make sure they get right in order for it to reach its full potential and therefore compete with the big two. If they don't get these right, they might not be in the top three and it might not matter when they launch. The first we'll talk about is the bland mapping experience. In Last Epoch, when you run a map, or as we call it, an echo, you have an objective that you want to go to complete the echo. It's usually something like chase down some rare enemies that are patrolling, or find a mini boss, or find an area where you have to click on something that spawns a bunch of enemies and then you kill them. There is literally no reason to explore the echo outside of doing the objective. Well, not literally. There is one where you can kill a bunch of enemies, and the more you kill, the better the chest is at the very end. But that chest really isn't worth it. It's not a very good incentive, and most of us just don't bother. Compare this to PoE, where there's a whole bunch of things that happen once you get inside a map. You can get, for example, some delving material. You can spawn the temple. I can't remember what it's called, but there's a whole bunch of different interactions that occurred depending on the map, and it's random or pseudo-random what you're going to get. So it's actually worth exploring and seeing what you can find. This is a stark contrast from what Last Epoch currently offers, and it makes Echo running very boring. So most of the end game is around the rewards you get for finishing the Echo, not for actually being inside the Echo. And this is something that needs to change, or else players are going to notice it very quickly and find that the actual moment-to-moment gameplay is kind of bland. This is a pretty big problem for a game where the moment-to-moment gameplay of combat is, well, that's what defines the genre. Between killing monsters and looting enemies, that's what you really want to do in your ARPG. So having one of those aspects be pretty bland is very unfortunate, and something that I think can really hold back Last Epoch from becoming one of the top contenders. So this is something that needs to be addressed moving forward. So the next one is one that I don't really notice very much personally, but a lot of people do, enough so to where I see comments on it in Reddit and on the forums and even in my own stream pretty often. So it's clearly something that a lot of players would like to see change and is affecting their enjoyment of the game, and that's the feel of combat. So in a lot of games, combat feels pretty visceral. It's got a lot of feedback to you. It's really got a lot of weightiness, and a significant number of players find that Last Epoch is missing something in that regard. It's harder for me to really nail down exactly what that is, since I don't feel it too much myself. There are some areas where I can definitely see it. For example, some of the enemies don't really provide any feedback when you hit them. They just kind of move forward and act like nothing happened unless they got stunned, in which case they'll just stand still and not really do anything. So it's these areas where a lot of players are definitely finding that the game just isn't quite up to the standards, particularly of the other two big ones. And if you're the kind of player who finds the feel of combat to be really important to you, having a game that's a little subpar in that is clearly going to have an effect on how much you might want to play that game. And so given that there's so many players that find this issue to be problematic, I think it really deserves to be considered when we factor in whether or not Last Epoch can eventually compete with the big two, because it's an area where clearly Last Epoch is currently lacking. Now, fortunately, the devs have made some strides in fixing this problem. Some of the new skills definitely feel weighty. Some of the newer enemies do have some feedback mechanics, although certainly not all of them. And it's something the devs have recognized as a area where they can improve going forward. So hopefully this will get some love in the near future. Now, the final topic I want to discuss is one that isn't a problem now, but I think it's worth adding to this because if it were to become a problem, it could have a serious effect on how many people play the game and for how long, and that is the seasonal content that we know we're going to get. We know we're going to have seasons called cycles, but we don't know a whole lot more about them. The devs have stated in the past that they want them to be somewhat different than the current season and league systems of Diablo 3 and Path of Exile, but we don't know in what way that's going to be different. But having it being different is a reason for at least some concern. It could be the case that the way they do it is really cool and provides flavor that the other two don't have and helps it to stand out from those. Or it could be that it's too far from the beaten path and what people really want is what's already there. And by going away from that model in any way causes the game to be less popular. So this is something we need to address because it's really important that they get seasonal content right, at least insofar as that it attracts players with whatever the league mechanics are, the season mechanics are, the cycle mechanics technically, and keeps them wanting to play the game every 3 months or whatever it is that Last Epoch decides to go with. So this is something to keep on our radar, and for the devs, of course, to keep on their radar. How far away do you want to go from the traditional seasonal / league style? And there's a lot of room to really work here because the seasons in Diablo 3 are quite a bit different than the Path of Exile ones. And I think most people would agree that you'd much rather have something like the leagues of Path of Exile than the seasons of Diablo 3, where there's very little content in Diablo when it's added. The last couple have had more content than previous ones, but still have very, very low amounts of content whenever you compare it to Path of Exile, which is adding significant mechanics to the game that are things that people can play throughout the game, add even crafting, like lots gets added when Path of Exile adds a new league. And so it'll be interesting to see where Last Epoch decides they should go with this, because if they go too far away from the traditional model, people could reject it. They could decide it's not what they want. So we'll have to wait and find out what they want to do with that, and hopefully they come up with something that really nails it. Otherwise, we could find that Last Epoch isn't living up to maybe the expectations of the player base. So those are the 8 ways in which I think that Last Epoch could potentially fail, at least in some regard. Now, I do want to reiterate that I don't think it's going to. I believe in EHG, I believe in the game, I believe they also are aware of at least most, if not all of these issues, and are doing something to try to alleviate them. With that being said, I still think this is a valuable discussion to be having, both so that we can set the expectations for ourselves as a community, but also so that we can relay to the devs how we feel about where the game is, the direction it's going in, and potential decisions that they're making along the way. The more that we openly communicate with the devs, the better understanding they're going to have of where we are, and possibly can use that information to make decisions that they otherwise might not make that might be better for the game long term. So in the spirit of that, maybe there are other areas of concern that you as a community member have that I haven't mentioned here that you really think the devs should know about, or we as a community should discuss. If so, I would love to hear what you have to say about that, either in the comments below or on my stream. I stream on Twitch 5 to 6 days a week, or also in my Discord. It's really good to have a discussion about these things. It's something I like to do. It's why I make videos like this. So I'd love to hear what you all think the game needs to do in order to succeed going forward. Thanks again for watching. I hope you have a great time in Last Epoch, and I'll see you all again real soon.